The international conference entitled Armenia as a Civilizational Crossroad, Historical and Cultural Ties has started in Yerevan, Armenia. The executive director of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, Elisa von Joeden-Forgey, is in Armenia within the framework of the conference. In the next minutes, we will talk about the prevention of genocides and Armenia as a global leader in this mission. Ms. von Joeden-Forgey, can you elaborate on the historical significance of Armenia in shedding light on genocide, particularly in reference to Armenian genocide?
So there are many resonances between the Armenian genocide and a more universal process of genocide. So the Armenian genocide is one of the most common patterns of genocide, which includes at first the mass murder of men and boys, right? And then sexual violence, forms of torture, deportation, expulsion of women and children, leading, in the Armenian case, to their deaths, right? This pattern of genocide is the one we see most commonly in history. And so the Armenian genocide is a very good central case for our study of comparative genocides, right? And it is on the basis of comparative genocides that we build our genocide prevention mechanisms. So a kind of recentering of the Armenian genocide within genocide studies, I think, will be very helpful to genocide prevention. But also, there's so many other connections between the Armenian genocide and Armenia's relationship to genocide prevention. One is that the Armenian genocide inspired Raphael Lemkin, the father of the Genocide Convention, to set out on a legal career, right? And to search for a word and then press for an international law against genocide. He was inspired in particular by the trial of Sogomon Tehlirian in Berlin in 1921, after Tehlirian had assassinated Talat Pasha, the architect of, or one of the architects of the Armenian genocide. Raphael Lemkin accounts to us in his autobiography that it was at that moment that he asked the fateful question, right? Why is the killing of one man a greater crime than the killing of millions? And so that's another connection that's, I think, very important not to overlook, that Raphael Lemkin modeled his early thinking about the crime of genocide on the Armenian case. And the Armenian case inspired him, of course, to pursue a genocide convention. So it's one of the reasons that we have a genocide convention. And then Armenians in the diaspora, the large diaspora that was created after the genocide, have had to fight for over 100 years for recognition of the genocide. The state that inherited the empire that committed the genocide, so Turkey, right, has still not recognized its accountability for the genocide, right, and has not pursued sort of justice initiatives that would work to repair the damage done through the genocide. And so there has not, so Turkey still exists in impunity, and this still haunts really Armenian-Turkish relationships and poses a threat, in fact, to Armenia. And so Armenians all over the world are some of the greatest experts in genocide recognition and the importance of recognition to survivors, to the memory of victims, but also to peace and security going forward, because without accountability, justice, and recognition, genocidal processes don't really come to an end. And I think we see that now in the geopolitical situation in the South Caucasus.
How has Armenia's advocacy for genocide recognition and prevention evolved over time? And what role has it played in international efforts to combat such atrocities?
So Armenia has been very involved in in the establishment of mechanisms for genocide prevention in the last 20 years. But what has happened really in the last decades has been that the state of Armenia has taken up the cause of genocide prevention. It works very closely with the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Genocide Convention at the UN. It sponsors the Global Forum Against the Crime of Genocide every 2 years, where it brings together a truly international body of scholars, NGOs, and government officials and UN officials to discuss, pressing topics in genocide prevention and to increase our knowledge and our practical ability to stop genocide. And it, of course, inaugurated really the December 9th commemoration of the victims of genocide, which is not just for the Armenian victims of genocide, but for all victims of genocide in human history. That was an initiative inaugurated at the UN by the state of Armenia.
How do you envision Armenia's leadership role in the global fight against genocide evolving in the future, especially in light of recent events such as in the conflict in Artsakh?
Yeah, I think the Armenian situation is very interesting because Armenia continues to experience genocidal threats, right? At the Lemkin Institute, we believe that that Azerbaijan's aggression against Artsakh since 2020 is genocidal in nature, and that the September 19th invasion of Artsakh was a genocide, actually a very effective genocide. 100%, almost 100% of the Artsakhi Armenians were forced out of their ancestral home of over 4,000 years within a matter of just a few days. So it was a very effective, very total genocide. So Armenia is facing these existential threats from its neighbors, Azerbaijan supported by Turkey, who are pursuing this in the name of a pan-Turkic expansionist ideology that is not so different from the ideology that drove the Hamidian massacres, the Adana massacre, and then, of course, the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. So alongside Armenia's work towards prevention, it also has to work on prevention in its own homeland. And that's a very interesting and difficult phenomenon. But I think what I would like to see Armenia do, and what I think Armenia is very well set up to do, is to be a global leader in prevention, because Armenians know what genocide is, they have experienced it, they have moral authority in the world as survivors of genocide who have created a very peaceful, stable society from the ruins of genocide. Armenians have shown great solidarity with other threatened communities, and Armenians have this ancient continuous civilization that can inform the work that they do in genocide prevention. Those are resources that many societies and many states do not have, right? So I think Armenia could be a real leader in genocide prevention, and that would serve two causes. One is to prevent genocide here, right? So to prevent a continuance of the genocidal patterns that we have seen up to this point in this region, right? To prevent Azerbaijan's threat to the existence and the sovereignty of the Republic of Armenia, right? To prevent an expansion of Turkish power, right, within Armenia proper, right, to prevent the erasure of this republic. So that's one side, and on the other side, while doing that, Armenia can be a spokesperson, right, for the cause of genocide prevention, demonstrating how important long-term prevention is in this region, in their region, right, while also bringing that message to the outside world and helping other societies who are either threatened by genocide who are struggling internally with genocidal processes, right, and who are seeking to shift their focus away from kind of genocidal institutions and genocidal ideologies towards more peaceful ways of engaging domestically and in foreign policy within the world. And so I see Armenia as taking a leadership position, serving its own national security interests, right? But also developing perhaps a consensus amongst smaller nations, particularly amongst nations in the global south who have experienced genocide, that they're going to be more actively involved at the UN level, but also at other multilateral levels to prevent genocide all over the world. We really need that sort of leadership from states because we're not getting it from the global powers currently.
Can you discuss also the importance of solidarity among nations in recognizing and preventing genocide?
Yes, you know, it's interesting. I think all nations that have experienced genocide have the basis to understand one another. Genocide is a very particular crime. You know, it's a very particular phenomenon. And because it seeks to extinguish a group identity as such, the harm that it does is very similar across cases. Different societies have different ways of dealing with that harm or trying to reconstruct after that harm, but the harm is very similar. So there's an immediate resonance between survivors of genocide. What often gets in the way of solidarity you know, are global political realities and alignments, right? So states that have a shared history of genocide sometimes can't work openly together because of the political alignments of larger powers in their regions. And that's where civil society becomes very important, right? Because civil society can do some of the work that it's a little more difficult for states sometimes to do, and can build bridges despite the fact that there are different political alignments, right? But I also think there must be room in the future for states that even aren't naturally aligned politically to work, states that have had genocide in their past, to work together as a kind of diverse coalition to stop genocide elsewhere, right? Because genocides happen under specific political circumstances, and sometimes one state will be better than another. It's sort of intervening diplomatically, quietly, behind the scenes to try and reduce, right, the threat of genocide. So I think a broad, very diverse political coalition of states from the global south is very needed in the world today. And truly, it's only through solidarity that we're going to be able to prevent genocide in the long term. What's happening now is that we're reinventing genocide prevention each time there's a crisis. And people have to fight alone to prevent their own genocide, right? So we saw that with Armenians and Artsaksis fighting seemingly alone to prevent that genocide. And now we see the Palestinians. The Palestinians have broader reach internationally, so there are international protests, but that took years and years and years of coalition building to create, right? You know, you have the Tigrayans and the Amharans in Ethiopia fighting alone. The Rohingya feel they're fighting alone. All of these groups are trying to build coalitions, but when the genocide process is becoming extreme, they're often alone, and the world reacts as if it's never seen this crime before. That has to stop, right? We need a sort of automatic mechanism that brings countries into genocide prevention when a situation reaches a certain threshold. There would be ways to create that. It would be sort of an automatic trigger, right, that sets in motion this coalition of states who are working in solidarity, not to advance certain political goals, but simply to advance the cause of genocide prevention, in the understanding that genocide is the most destructive crime that human beings could commit against one another. Once genocide is done, there is very little justice for it, even if there are ICC cases or international tribunals. There is no way to bring justice for the loss that is experienced in genocide. We must prevent it and keep people from suffering like this. And the only way to do it is through state solidarity and civil society solidarity.
So, are there specific policy recommendations or strategies that you believe Armenia should prioritize in the continued efforts to combat genocide and promote human dignity on the global stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Armenia should continue what it's doing, but perhaps, you know, with greater resources and greater human and capital investments. So, you know, some things that Armenia could do is, number one, I really think it would be very useful to the international community to share the values, right, that are expressed through Armenian civilization. As an ancient, continuous civilization, Armenians have been on the planet a long time and have real insights on how to live peacefully with one another and with the environment. And I think that, you know, these values, they're often studied as, you know, just Armenian values, but they have a universal dimension. And not only that, there's a universal need for these values. So I would love to see Armenia sort of undergo an enlightenment, right, where it takes these, this knowledge and these values and converts them into universal principles that can drive genocide prevention. So that would be, you know, that would involve engaging scholars with genocide prevention here in Armenia, in making sure Armenian scholarly work is translated into global languages, Russian, Chinese, English, Spanish, for example, right, Arabic. So to make sure that this research is being translated, to make sure that there's cultural diplomacy going on that uses the work of Armenian scholars and Armenian think tanks, right, to engage the outside world in some of the initiatives that Armenians decide to lead. So I think things like that, really kind of a cultural push internationally to bring Armenian insights to the rest of the world would be helpful to the world. It's necessary. We need that in the world.
In this context, what role can other countries play in supporting Armenia's efforts?
Well, I think that, you know, the most important shift that needs to happen internationally is that there has to be a final agreement that Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, is a sovereign state, and that Armenians in Artsakh have a right to at least hear their self-determination claims adjudicated in the international arena. The international community must get serious about Armenian sovereignty claims and must do everything they can to protect that sovereignty. What we see now is too much, too little commitment, I think, to Armenian sovereignty. And this is a problem that many post-genocide peoples and states, right, suffer, which is the original violation that was the genocide never truly goes away, and it can end up marking the survivors with this notion internationally that they can be removed, that they can be forced out, that they can be turned into refugees, that they don't really have serious sovereignty. So what I think the world needs to do is make it plain to Armenia's current enemies, and those enemies have stated that they are enemies, right, by using genocidal Armenophobic statements in their public speeches, right? They don't always have to be enemies, but you can't be a friend and an ally if you're using genocidal language, right? So I think the international community needs to make it clear to Turkey, to Azerbaijan, and other states that would challenge Armenian sovereignty, that it is going to take Armenian sovereignty claims just as seriously as it takes other sovereignty claims, right? So that any invasion of Armenian sovereign space is seen as a crime against the international order. And I don't see that sort of language on the side of Russia, on the side of the United States, on the side of the EU. And there needs to be the there needs to be this sort of consensus formed, right, in these large powers that Armenian sovereignty is not up for grabs and it's not up for negotiation. And that means there needs to be strong backing of the Armenian state.
How do you see Armenia's role in the broader context of international human rights advocacy, and what potential collaborations or partnerships could further enhance its impact in this area?
Yeah, well, Armenia is doing so much work in terms of law, human rights law, especially in terms of advocating for, advocating for its POWs being held by Azerbaijan, right? Or advocating for its right to exist without racist language being used by some of its neighbors, right? So Armenia is really good at using international law for the cause of justice, accountability, and peace. And so I think, any partnership that engages that already really well-developed side of the Armenian sort of approach to human rights will be very important. So this includes partnerships between Armenian universities and global universities, which is already happening. Certainly Armenian leadership at the United Nations, which we see a lot in terms of genocide prevention, but of course Armenia could be involved in so many other aspects as well. This all takes manpower, so it's hard. Armenia is a small country, right? And you need a lot of people to be doing all of this engagement. But I already see that here. Armenian civil society is incredibly well developed. So bilateral, multilateral relationships between different civil society organizations in Armenia and outside of Armenia. I really think Armenians need to work globally. And the value of that, right, to the outside world will be immediately apparent.
Thank you very much for interview and for sharing your important ideas with us.
Great. Thank you so much. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure.